Hello everyone, it's Shane Kanto, your Wasteland reviewer, and I'm going to review Sweet Girl. And this is a new crime thriller, action thriller from Netflix starring Jason Momoa and Dora the Explorer herself, Isbela Merced. And this film focuses on a family. The wife is dying of cancer, her medications are pulled by a pharmaceutical company who's being investigated by the government, and wife dies. Sends the husband, Jason Momoa, off the rails, and he's caught up into a crazy conspiracy leading up to, within just the first 20 minutes of this movie, death and conspiracy and all kinds of craziness, and it leads to most of the film being Jason Momoa and his daughter, played by Merced, on the road, trying to bring justice, trying to get away, and trying to bring those responsible for his wife's deaths to the light. And there's a conspiracy who hired this hitman that pops up earlier in the film and is chasing them throughout, played by Manuel Garcia Rolfo, who I know from the new Magnificent Seven, who is intimidating enough with his presence but doesn't really get to do a whole lot in the film. But you have Jason Momoa, who shows a lot of emotional range, and he's very raw, and that's both in his emotional scenes and also his rage-induced scenes. And then you have Merced, who is along for the ride, and you get to see some strong acting from her. And focusing on what works best in this film is when there's action, I think it's really effective. And Brian Andrew Mendoza, who's the director here, who has produced a lot of Momoa's previous films, knows how to really bring some energy to these action sequences. They're not particularly new or inventive or interesting, but at least they're thrilling. You get that from the action sequences. Where this film really went awry for me is that, it feels pretty derivative of like The Fugitive kind of story. This feels like The Fugitive. We're on the run, we're running from people trying to kill us, and nothing particularly interesting about that. And like, even this is all about pharmaceutical company, just like The Fugitive. Didn't think about that while I was watching the film. Now I'm thinking about it right now and just like, oh, okay. This kind of makes me feel this is even more derivative of The Fugitive, but that's not even the worst part. There are things that are revealed in this film that feel like they're just there for like, oh my god, it's a twist! And honestly, if they would have went with a more straightforward approach to this narrative, it probably actually would have been a much more interesting film and felt a little bit different. And it probably would have felt like some other films, but I don't want to say too much. But there's a big reveal in the third act here that just feels like, wow, this really went there. And if you look back at it, there's some obvious points where it's like, oh, like, this makes sense, but, like, why? And it's a choice, and it makes you rethink all the events that have happened for most of the film. And it's one of those things where it's like, wow, it just didn't work for me. It felt really flat. My reaction to the twist was like, it was, what? And you don't want that kind of reaction. And then the film, there's still like 25 minutes left in this movie. I remember hitting the button like, oh, this is probably wrapping up. So I'm like, there's like almost a half hour left. And which the film, I think, feels a little overlong and drawn out. Because like, it has a really simple narrative that could have been like, this did not need to be an hour and 50 minutes. But when it really comes down to the end of it, it's just like, okay, this had some interesting ideas that felt like they were really mishandled for the sake of having twists and turns and stuff like that. So in the end, this movie kind of made me mad, honestly, and I don't feel like I got a whole lot out of the enjoyment here. I think if the twist works for you, you'll get a lot more out of this film and feel like, okay, this was an exciting, streamable film. There it is. Like Jason Momoa, he's great in it. Isbela Merced, she's really good in it. But depending on how you feel about where the story and where this film takes you is really going to be contingent upon how you feel about this film. And I know some people were even complaining about like it shifts out of nowhere in like 20 minutes into the film to being like this crazy action thriller. I'm like, it is what it is. To me, like, that didn't bother me. Like, I assume that's what this film was about. That's how the trailers kind of sold it, wasn't it? So, it's a crazy, ridiculous action thriller, and if the ridiculousness that happens along the way doesn't take you out of the film, I think you'll have some nice thrills out of it. But those are my thoughts on Sweet Girl. Let me know what you think, and let's talk some movies. But thank you as always for tuning in and supporting your Wasteland reviewer.